How many more pay-per-views did you sell than Canelo did tonight?
Well, I don't know. I hope they did well. I think they're insane to go the same night as us. It literally doesn't make sense.
Did you notice they would?
I watched it ringside.
Did you pay for it?
Yes.
All right, so Dana White is practically begging fans to illegally stream events these days, seeing how pay-per-view prices have gone up, ticket prices for live events have gone up, and the quality of cards has been on the decline for years now, and frankly, I'm happy to oblige him. Also, if you've been paying attention, then you might know that UFC 315, which is going down tomorrow, still has not sold out, and for UFC standards, this event has already been a massive financial disappointment, and it hasn't even begun yet. As much as I love the sport and want to support it, Dana's greed seems intent on watering down the overall UFC product, and honestly, I think it's impossible to justify the cost of being a hardcore fan these days. No, I don't take pride in or even like the fact that I'm fleecing pay-per-views, but at the same time, I don't really feel all that bad about it because the UFC's been increasingly fleecing fans for a while now. Pay-per-views are expensive, and they don't even make sense in this day and age. Look, you can call me broke all you want, you're not wrong, but if Dana himself is out here illegally streaming boxing events, then you better keep that same energy with him too. And yeah, in this video, I'll be talking about all this and more. Guys, UFC 315 is tomorrow, and the event still has hundreds of seats left to sell. And even though I do think Bilal Muhammad is a slightly more interesting champion than Leon Edwards, it doesn't really change the fact that this guy couldn't sell water to a man dying of thirst. But you know, maybe the UFC stacked the rest of the main card to make up for Bilal's lack of star power, right? Not really. At least not enough to get people to buy tickets, clearly. Of course, I like JDM a lot, and Aldo versus Sahabi's gonna be a really good fight, but otherwise, I'm pretty indifferent on the other three matchups. Like, I really don't love the fact that they put two women's fights on the main card, but at least one of them's a title fight, I guess? My point here being, I really don't think the lineup of fighters on this card drives much interest unless you're a super hardcore fan of the UFC, and even then I think that we can agree that these fights don't necessarily scream fireworks. I don't know, let's just say that I understand why this event still hasn't come close to selling out the arena, and it's obvious that the UFC is panicking over this because they've slashed ticket prices multiple times this week, and even up to yesterday there were sections that still had over 100 unsold seats, but it seems like the latest round of price reductions has been helping move tickets. When you look at this fight card from top to bottom, it's honestly a bit absurd that the UFC expected an average fan to pay $450 for nosebleed tickets on a card that feels so pedestrian. And although it sucks for the fighters involved that they got stuck on this nothing burger of a card, I'm not gonna lie, it does make me a little bit happy that Dana's greed is biting him in the ass this time around. Make pay-per-view cards great again. I'm not saying that the UFC has to try to make every single pay-per-view the biggest event of the year because that's totally unreasonable, but I really don't think it's unreasonable to ask that they make their major cards be a little bit better than what we've been getting lately. And I definitely think it's more than reasonable to ask that the overall quality of UFC 315 be better than what we're getting this weekend. Because if they have Bilal Muhammad and Valentina Shevchenko as co-headliners, no offense, but they're not exactly swinging for the fences when it comes to marketability or excitement.
315 is 4 days away from now, and the arena still has so many empty seats available. Yeah, because they oversaturated the market. They got away from what made the UFC different than boxing, where they would stack cards. So you'd be like, I'll buy this. 5 fucking entertaining fights? I'm in. Boxing model was one main event, the rest you've never heard of them.
Right.
So the numbers aren't great. And UFC, at least once a month, once every 3 months, you'd have these insane cards.
Yeah.
But they went, nah, we're going to do what boxing does because that's going great.
Like, the idea of paying standard prices for a substandard product feels a little bit disrespectful from our UFC overlord. Which brings me to my next point, the undeniable shrinkflation of UFC events. For those of you unaware of the term, shrinkflation is basically when a company offers you less of a thing while you still pay the same amount for it. And that is exactly what's happening with UFC pay-per-views. Up until like the mid-2010s, we would get cards featuring title fights, title eliminators, and grudge matches all in one night on a pretty regular basis. And that's the big difference between UFC events then versus now. The overall quality of events nowadays is so much more lackluster than what they used to be. But back even just a couple of years ago, it felt like the UFC was more willing to invest money and manpower into elevating a shitty headlining fight by putting more interesting fighters and matchups on the undercard to support it. But in the current era of the promotion, you can feel the emphasis on cost cutting in almost every single aspect of what they do. Yes, the cards feel less stacked than they ever have, but pre-fight press conferences are like 20 minutes now if we're lucky. The Apex cards definitely overstayed their welcome by like 3 years, and I don't even remember the last time that they did a press tour, which they definitely should have done for UFC 300. I mean, the purpose of Dana White's Contender Series is to sign up-and-coming fighters for a discounted rate, and seeing as about a third of the UFC roster have come from it, then I'd say that it's doing a good job at accomplishing its goal. You know, at the risk of sounding like an entitled fan, it does feel a little bit insulting that they insist on giving us less of what we want, but then ask us to pay $12 a month for ESPN Plus so that we can then get the opportunity to pay $80 for each pay-per-view. And speaking of pay-per-view prices, do you guys remember in 2019 when the cost to purchase an event was $59.99? Then over the course of the next 6 years up to now, they've hiked up the price 4 times. And I understand that ESPN are the ones in control over the pay-per-view prices, and the UFC has even publicly stated that they disagree with the price increases, but that doesn't change the fact that making every pay-per-view $80 on top of the watered-down cards creates the worst value proposition for UFC fans in the history of the company.
For sure, by the way, they are down. This has been known for some time. The question is exactly how much they're down, but they're down pretty significantly. That's really not at issue. The question is kind of more interesting, which is ESPN pays UFC $20 million per pay-per-view, and then they get to, whatever they pull back on the pay-per-view end, they basically get to keep. But $20 million, that's pretty fucking significant, which means they have to sell higher than 300,000 pay-per-view buys, at least on average, in order for that to be returned. And that's really not been happening.
Look, I love MMA and I genuinely want to support it financially, but the UFC seems hell-bent on making it harder to want to spend money on their events. They want more money for less quality. They have become so transparent in trying to fleece our wallets by giving us less for more, and it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Now, you might not believe it, but I actually used to pay for a lot of the cards that I watched. I would fork out the money for the good pay-per-views in order to support the UFC and the fighters that I really cared about. I didn't mind it too much because for the most part, I did feel like it was a good enough return on investment. I am still willing to buy the cards that I know for sure will be certified bangers, but frankly, the last time that happened was for UFC 300. Not only that, I do pay for ESPN Plus so I can actually watch the free cards in high quality, even though ESPN Plus is utter dog shit and crashes 12 times every fight night. Now, I am saying all of this because I want you guys to know that I am personally willing to pay what I can in order to support a product that I have been watching for 17 years. But nowadays, with the quality of basically everything about the UFC being down and the cost of events being the highest it's ever been, I can only justify forking out all that money on a pay-per-view when I know that beyond a shadow of a doubt that it'll be worth the $80. Otherwise, I'm still gonna watch the event. I'm just gonna stream it instead. And if you don't like the fact that I watch illegal streams, then cry about it to Dana himself, because this guy definitely pirated the Canelo versus Plant boxing fight during a UFC pay-per-view event.
To go the same night as us, it literally doesn't make sense.
Did you notice they would?
I watched it ringside.
Did you pay for it?
Yes.
Now, of course, he doesn't admit to pirating the fight, but just look at his face, man. He clearly did. And all the reporters in the room start laughing because they can pick up on what he's not so subtly putting down. Also, if you know anything about Dana's beef with Showtime, then you'll know that his petty ass would never give them his money. He hates them way too much.
Watch some of these boxing events that are on. I mean, Showtime is f***ing horrible. Those guys suck so bad. You f***ing guys could show up with your f***ing video cameras and do a better job than It's seriously, it's the worst production in all of television. Fucking PBS has better fucking programming than Showtime. It's horrible. Everybody that works on that fucking show should be embarrassed.
Look, do I even need to say it? If Dana, whose net worth is estimated to be $500 million, is out here pirating streams, then my broke ass is going to do it too, guiltlessly. And you might be saying that there's a difference between Dana stealing from Showtime and me stealing from the UFC, but I don't know if that's true. At the end of the day, we are two consumers who want to enjoy the product that a company produces, but for our own personal reasons, we're both taking a principled stance against giving them our money. And if you think that my reasoning behind this is dumb, then very well, I can live with that. But as long as you can also admit that a man with $500 million not spending $80 on a boxing pay-per-view event, meanwhile he's giving $250,000 to a kid half his age and betting $15,000 a hand on blackjack is also dumb. At the end of the day, we are all entitled to do what we want with our money and spend it however which way we please. I would love nothing more than to open my wallet and support a well-run event featuring exciting matchups from top to bottom, but lately, every time I check the upcoming UFC cards, it feels like I'm looking at some regional fight night with 1 or 2 maybe high-profile fights at the very top. And if you have been a fan for a while now, then you might feel the same way as me when I say that the pivot from how they used to build cards to how they build cards now feels like a slap in the face. Dana White loves to talk about piracy being the biggest threat to the sport, but piracy is just a symptom, not the cause. The cause is Dana and the UFC's relentless greed and the refusal to put on cards worth the steep prices that they charge. At the end of the day, UFC 315 is symbolic of a larger problem. Dana and the UFC brass have gotten complacent and think that the UFC brand alone will compel fans to shell out any amount of money. But the reality of the situation is that this is simply a market correction. Shrinkflation, where illegal streaming sites recognize the wants and concerns of UFC fans better than the UFC itself does. If the UFC keeps pushing lackluster events like UFC 315 that's filled with fighters few casuals even recognize, they're not only inviting us, but practically begging us to pirate the streams. And honestly, I'm perfectly happy to take them up on it. Anyways, that is the video for today. Definitely let me know your thoughts on the gradual deterioration of the UFC product. Are you fed up with the UFC trying to milk us like we're farm cows, or am I just being overly critical? As always, if you like the video, then like the video, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so. I appreciate you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.
The same story with David Goggins.
Yeah, I saw a video on the YouTube. Was the most funny video. The title was David Goggins, the place where fighters go to die, you know, something like that. Like,
bro, did you watch the video?
Place where UFC careers go to die, you know?
Bro,
because it's like the last resort, right? Let's go to... No, it's not.
It was like the last person who did that.
Did you watch the video?